Hello, my name is Yoo-Jin Kim from Hanmaum Church in Chuncheon. I grew up studying abroad in the US and I even got accepted to an Ivy League university. However, I wandered in life, then I ended that wandering when I met the risen Jesus. I want to share this testimony with you. I excelled in academics, but I always fixated on my shortcomings, constantly comparing myself with others and treating myself harshly because of it. This made my life very difficult. When I was in third grade, my family followed my dad to the United States to a city in Texas. At the time, the only English I knew were the capital letters of the alphabet. But I had a tendency to pick up languages quickly, and starting from the sixth grade, I was a student who was used to getting A+. We also asked my aunt to mail textbooks and workbooks to us from Korea so that I wouldn't forget Korean, and I followed both the Korean and American school curricula at the same time. Studying like this made me have a very easy time with regular school, so I applied to a middle school with an accelerated program where I was once again recognized as an outstanding student. I became a role model of sorts to the kids in the Korean community. Korean moms would call my mom, asking for advice on how to help their kids do well in school. There was one mom who even tried to have my clothes handed out to her kids based on an old superstition. I later found out that I used to be a source of envy for some kids as well. I attended an accelerated science and math high school that ranked around the top 0.1% of the American high schools. I became valedictorian for one semester in my senior year, then graduated as the salutatorian. Then I received scholarships from some major organizations and also got accepted to an Ivy League university. As a result, I was asked by kids around me to tell them how they could perform in school like I did. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them anything. The truth was that all throughout high school, I'd always thought that I was completely incompetent. That was because all I could see was how much better my peers were than myself. I had been surrounded by admirably bright and outstanding students, and no matter how much my class rank went up, they all seemed so much better than me. I thought all I was good at was getting high grades. I had a friend who ranked just below me, but was such a gifted writer. The girl who graduated as valedictorian was incredibly gifted in math. I had friends whom I might outperform in school, but had stellar character and personalities that I couldn't dream of emulating. These thoughts made me grow dejected. Despite where I had gotten accepted, I felt no sense of accomplishment, and I wasn't pleased or satisfied in the least with my capabilities. My family had studied abroad in the US for a long time, so we didn't have much money. I decided to give up on the Ivy League school and attend a state university, which was much cheaper. I entered as a computer science major. Again, it was ranked among the highest in the nation, and within that, I was accepted into a rigorous honors program. I tried to begin college with a fresh attitude, but not long after I started school, I found out that university was completely different from what I had expected. University, in reality, was a place that taught no differently than high school, just a level higher. Then after I graduated, I would do the same thing I was doing in school at a job I found. Then I'd have to study, research, and work at this intense pace to maintain my social status and paycheck for the rest of my life. That was when all motivation for studying vanished. I tried really hard to study, but I found myself unable to go on. I didn't go to class. Instead, I read novels and watched movies all day. When my GPA plummeted, I was dropped from my scholarship and honors program. Everything had spiraled downhill so fast that I was in disbelief. I couldn't sleep at night, and when I did, I wished that I wouldn't wake up in the morning. How do I escape the life of an endless cycle of meaningless toil? As I thought about that, I began to seriously think about pursuing art. Ever since I was little, I'd buried a desire for it in order to pursue academics and success. Art was a much more unstable career field in comparison, and chance of success were much slimmer, but this was something I actually had a passion for, so I threw myself into it with a desperate hope. I decided on this change in direction without telling my parents. I had also started later than others, so I thought I had to pour everything into it. I removed my bed at one point so that I could only catch blinks on the couch to save time. When that wasn't enough, I spent the night in the art building. Thanks to all the frenzy, I dropped 30 pounds, and my roommate said that I didn't live like a human being. But maybe due to all the effort, my work was being recognized as one of the best in the department, but this gave me no peace. When I compared my work to the top artists in the world, my work looked infinitely lacking and I could hardly breathe out of anxiety and dejection. I had thrown myself into art. Was this all I could do? These kinds of thoughts drove me into an even deeper despair, and there wasn't an ounce of satisfaction. While these thoughts were wearing me down, a young man from another state made national headlines when he fired shots into his university and killed 32 people. The day it happened, I was supposed to turn in a major art project. That was a third of my grade. But instead of finishing the project and turning it in, I stayed home reading news article after news article on the shooting all day long, seeing myself exactly behind this young man's eyes. That was when I thought for the first time that I couldn't keep living like this. Around that time, a deacon from a Korean church started working at the office where I worked. As I observed him, I began to think that I wanted to be like him. He was diligent and good at his job, and he always seemed so grounded and at peace. As I watched him, I wondered if God could show me how to live life the way I should. I wanted this deacon's assurance in life, so I began to attend his church. It was a huge leap of faith on my part because I hated getting involved in places like churches. But after I started going to church, I was met with the biggest crisis of my life. The church didn't talk about things of this world. It talked about heaven and hell. I needed to go to heaven, but when I looked at how I was, I just couldn't be sure that I'd end up there. In fact, the more I heard the message, the more I became sure that I was not going to end up there. I couldn't do anything before I solved the problem of my salvation. Then I had to come back to Korea and try to get my visa renewed to go to grad school. However, my visa was denied and I couldn't get back into the US. I thought that this was God's punishment for me for being so hard-hearted and unrepentant. And with the issue of salvation unresolved, I hit rock bottom. Then my rage and hatred against God skyrocketed, and having completely lost any hope in life, I lived in my room for a year and didn't see anyone except my parents. Then I was told by the church I used to attend in the US to try visiting a church in Chuncheon called Hanmaum Church, and emailed me video links to testimonies of people who had gotten their issue of salvation resolved. As I watched them, I thought that I could find my answers at this church. So I went there and was introduced to a lady who offered to have regular fellowship meetings with me. It was my first time meeting anyone outside of the house in a year, and I was in a completely dejected and oppressed state at the time. I would stare at the ground during conversations and take an abnormally long time giving one-word answers to very simple questions. I couldn't retain anything we discussed, and I made no progress for a year. But still, as I kept listening, I started hearing the word resurrection. I could believe that Jesus had been a real person who had existed, but I felt like I had to delve deeper into investigating his resurrection in order to believe it happened. The biggest problem I had with confirming whether the resurrection actually happened was that there was no piece of evidence that satisfied any of my five senses, like a photograph or footage. I was told that the most critical piece of evidence for the resurrection was the fact that Jesus' disciples were so certain of his resurrection that they staked their own lives on this fact, but I wasn't satisfied with that. I wanted something more than the assurance of human beings. Their deaths did not satisfy me. But one day I realized that my problem wasn't the lack of evidence for the resurrection. I had reached the point where I was sick of thinking about the resurrection. This problem was too hard for me to solve. But if I didn't solve this problem and didn't confirm the resurrection for myself, I thought all of my life and every relationship I had with people would be meaningless. This was when a friend of mine at church and I were asked to share the gospel with someone. Before we went to meet with that person, we went to a meeting where they were discussing the gospel. At this meeting, a lady said something that struck me. She said, I was making judgments based on my own standards. I had thought that I lacked the evidence to say that the resurrection happened because I was not satisfied with the evidence at hand. But what she said made me realize that it was a waste of time trying to come up with a piece of evidence that could satisfy me. I was able to escape my subjective viewpoint and look at the resurrection objectively. Then, I was able to see that the resurrection was something that had actually happened. It was an event that even non-Christian scholars had acknowledged as a part of human history. Then when I looked at the disciples of Jesus, who had actually given their lives to testify to his resurrection from an objective perspective, it was confirmed to me that they really did meet the risen Jesus. If they hadn't confirmed the fact that eternity actually exists by seeing him risen, there was no way that they would have given up their entire lives for the sole cause of testifying to this fact, even unto their deaths. The resurrection was not an event that could be erased just because I didn't believe it happened. The resurrection really was fact. It was the greatest relief in the world to discover that. But then during one morning prayer time, I was reminded of a verse from 2 Corinthians. Examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you unless, of course, you fail the test? I was praying, God, I really need to pass this test. Then, I was reminded of another verse. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. Then my wicked heart was completely revealed to me. I had been looking at my lackings, my weaknesses, and everything else that wasn't the God-given proof of the resurrection, and completely ignoring Jesus. It was such a shameful and wicked sin. He had died on the cross for me and risen again to prove that he was my Lord. And yet, I had completely ignored him, putting all kinds of dirty things in my heart, and thrown Jesus aside. But he had waited patiently for me for a long time, and he had not stopped loving me. Even as I listened to the devil's lies and ignored and misunderstood him, he said that he loved me. I told Jesus that I was so sorry, that he was my Lord and my God, but I had ignored him all this time, that I had been wrong, and I repented in tears. After I repented like this, I realized why I had lived such a hard life. I had really wanted to be God himself, to be perfect in every way and control everything according to how I wanted. No matter how high I climbed, I wanted to get higher, so I had no happiness or satisfaction. If I had become the world's best scholar or artist, if I had been at the top, I wouldn't be satisfied at all. Because I had been the Lord of myself, I had judged everything according to my own standards and greed, and that was why I had lived such a hard life, filled with dissatisfaction and absolutely no appreciation for the abilities and talents that God had granted me. That was why I had wandered so much in life. Now my salvation is no longer shaken, because Jesus rose from the dead.
Amen.
I live today hoping in the kingdom of heaven I will enter, because I repented and received Jesus as Lord through his resurrection. Due to this, there were changes in my life. Now I can have normal conversations with people without staring at the ground all the time. Recently, I had a chance to share about my life in detail with the sister at church who had had fellowship with me for that 1 year. After I was done, she told me in an astonished voice, "I had no idea you were capable of talking for this long. I also had no idea that you were this good at Korean. This has got to be the work of the Holy Spirit." Also, I used to be individualistic to a fault. I even distanced myself from my family members, and if they tried to cross the lines I had drawn, I considered them as enemies. But when everything became resolved in the risen Jesus, I was able to be unafraid of being judged and share my life with the church community, and being with people wasn't burdensome anymore. I would also blame my personality and be extremely cynical about personal relationships, but that also became resolved, and I can approach people in peace without worry or fear, and even share the gospel. At first, I compared myself with other members in the church, and it really oppressed me to think that my faith seemed so much weaker than theirs and that I had to catch up quickly. However, when the gospel became clear to me, I realized that there was absolutely no reason to think that way. I'm currently working on a team that produces dubbed versions of our church members' testimonies in English. Up to this point in my life, I only strove to reach higher for myself. It wasn't satisfying, and I only ended up wandering in life. No matter how great a talent you may have, when you used it for yourself, there was no satisfaction at all. No matter how small a talent you may have, using it for the Lord gives you true satisfaction and joy. This is what I'm finding out through serving on the dubbing team. What is important is not how great my talents or capabilities are, but who I'm living for right now. Amen. Living for the Lord makes me truly happy and joyful. Thank you.